read my first essay, just tell you a little bit about how I came to work on this book. And that is that I'd been writing essays for about 10 years, or in the essay format. I've been writing for all my life, but I'd been writing the essay format since about 2004. And in 2013, I just had the idea, since I like the idea of staying close to home. You know, when I was young, I had a decade of it was what I call my peripatetic years, when I lived in Europe and traveled to Ecuador and Iceland and so forth. But then I settled down in Eugene eventually, and I wanted to really settle down and not leave Lane County for 1 year. And so I initially was thinking of walking what I call the fence line of Lane County, so the whole border of Lane County, and of course writing essays about that. But that became totally overwhelming, not just in terms of the amount of time it would take, but I'd have to cross private land and probably wear a bulletproof vest so I didn't get shot. And it was just too over the top. And so I decided instead I didn't know at the beginning of the year what I would write about. And it took a few weeks for the first essays to start. So a lot of people know me as a nature writer. I write about trees and so forth. And so many of the essays are like that, but some are about city issues, and I'll read one tonight here. A couple are about events or experiences I had when I lived in Europe, just because I'm in Lane County. I didn't physically leave Lane County all year, but I mentally left Lane County more than a few times, you know, recalling things that had happened to me in the past. And so those essays are in here too. The first one I'm going to read is called Balm of Gilead. So, it's the third week of May here in the West Cascades, where the new fronds of sword ferns are now nearly fully unfurled, and the hermit warblers have been back for several weeks already. The temperature about midday is certainly in the mid-60s, yet it's snowing lightly. The flakes vary a great deal in size, from maybe 1/4 of an inch across to some that are as wide as 1.5 inches. But instead of floating more or less directly earthward, they seem at times to wander aimlessly among the tall moss-covered trunks of the broadleaf trees above and around me. The boughs of young hemlocks in the forest under canopy are starting to accumulate a bit of the snowfall now, and in the tiny stream nearby, still pools have become nearly covered in white. Curiously, there's not a cloud in the sky, so the casual observer might well be puzzled by these events. But I'm not. I've been here other years about this time and seen it snow before. The snow, of course, is the cottony fluff of the cottonwood trees high above me, which bloomed earlier this spring and are now releasing their tiny seeds. Each seed is attached to a small piece of cotton. The larger pieces of fluff floating by me have multiple seeds in them with conjoined fluff. Not all of the cottonwoods in this stand are releasing seed-bearing fluff right now, as many of the trees are male. They shed their pollen back in March, which was carried by the wind to fertilize the flowers on the female trees. The pollen-bearing organs of the male trees then fell off, but the female organs remained on the trees until the seeds matured. By mid-June, when there will be no more cotton to shed nor seeds to launch into the clear blue sky, they'll drop to the ground as well, having completed their reproductive duty for the year. I've always found this stand of trees especially attractive, as it's composed almost entirely of broadleaf trees, cottonwoods for the most part, but also quite a few red alders and bigleaf maples. Most of the trees are about my age or a little older, having colonized this moist valley bottom site following a wildfire sometime in the mid-1940s. I'm reminded of the hardwood forests of southeastern Pennsylvania where I grew up, as the light that comes through the leafy canopy here is similar to that which filters through the forest canopy where I spent some of the best days of my youth. The quality of the light in a stand of broadleaf trees is very different from that which reaches the forest floor in a stand of conifers, which dominate most of the landscape of Western Oregon, because the light passes through the thin, broad leaves rather than being blocked by the thicker, darker needles of our native conifers. When cottonwood trees first break bud in early spring and begin to leaf out, this area is fragrant with the sweet smell of the propolis-like compound which coats the new leaves. Even now, less than a month from the summer solstice, the lovely scent persists. Whenever I smell it, it makes me smile and sigh, as it's truly aromatherapeutic. That is, smelling it makes me feel good. Early Euro-Americans in this region called these trees Balm of Gilead, a biblical reference to a possibly related tree, that is, a cottonwood or a poplar, that likely grew in the Middle East, the scent of which was restorative or, quote-unquote, balmy. These days, the word balmy is often used to refer to a warm winter day among a long string of more seasonably cold ones, but the word properly refers more to the scent of the air than its temperature. In fact, it's more than just the scent of the Balm of Gilead that is restorative. Resin from the tree's buds is highly medicinal. It is antibacterial, antifungal, and mildly analgesic, and is an ingredient in cough syrups and first aid salves used by herbalists to heal small wounds, cuts, and scrapes. Although most everyone these days calls these fragrant and cotton-producing trees cottonwoods, a few old-timers, especially in rural areas of Western Oregon, still refer to them as BAM trees. The word BAM is clearly a diminutive of Balm of Gilead, or simply balm trees, and BALM just became BAM, balm, 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 bam, 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 over time. The tree's contemporary name, cottonwood, certainly reflects a notable characteristic of the species, the cottony masses that disseminate its seeds, but its now archaic name, Balm of Gilead, still holds a special and aromatic place in my heart. So, as I said, not all these are nature essays, quote unquote. Most of them are. That's where I spend most of my time. And actually, maybe you didn't know that this is my Sabbath today, and I'm being forced to stay in town to do this. Usually I'm in the woods all day Thursday. So for decades, I've gone to the woods every Thursday, every week of the year. It doesn't matter what the weather is. And so this week I'm going tomorrow. So I had a number of people, including 2 of my students today, who asked me what I was doing here today. This is what I'm doing. So one of the essays that's not about quote-unquote nature is about where I live, and it's called The Bench. Passers-by sometimes mistake my property for a public park. When I've on occasion had the opportunity to ask a visitor what it is about my yard that prompts that response, some of them refer to the lot's attractive landscape, in contrast to several less well-kept neighbors' properties, and others point to the welcome sign at the base of the boardwalk ramp that leads upslope into the front yard. But usually, the visitors refer to the cedar bench located not 10 feet from my property, 10 feet into my property from the public sidewalk. It's a simple enough bench made out of western red cedar. Because I do, in fact, welcome the public onto my property, I wanted a place where visitors could feel comfortable sitting down and just resting or enjoying the landscape which I've created. The bench, of course, had to be visible from the public sidewalk so passers-by know it's there, and it also had to be far enough from the sidewalk and surrounded with enough vegetation to afford some privacy from the public realm of the street and the sidewalk. Likewise, it had to be far enough from the house so visitors don't feel they're either intruding on or being watched by the residents. I'm very particular about benches, most of which I find rather uncomfortable due to their poor design. But one fall, when I was teaching a field class in the redwood forests of coastal Northern California, I came upon a trailside bench that was just perfect. It was carved out of a redwood log, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, as if about 1/4 of the log in the longitudinal sense had been removed, creating a flat area for sitting and a flat back to lean against. The bench was so simple and so strikingly comfortable that I took some notes of its angles. The angle from the horizontal at which the seat was tilted, the angle from the vertical at which the back was tilted, and then the angle between the back and the seat itself, which was a little more than 90 degrees. Later, back in Eugene, when I had both the time and the money, I hired a carpenter to build for me the perfect bench according to the specifications I'd noted in Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, just east of Crescent City, California. Using 2 short planks of scrap wood and several adjustable clamps, my carpenter made a bench mock-up for me to try out. We then played with the angles of both the seat and the back until I thought it was a perfect replica of the redwood log bench I'd fallen in love with. Then he got to work constructing this important addition to my front yard. The bench was installed, appropriately enough, beneath a towering two-trunked coast redwood tree at the entrance to my property that shaded much of the front yard. Even on a hot summer day, the redwood's deep shade and low-hanging branches afforded a relatively cool and fairly secluded spot to rest. And over the years, I caught glimpses now and again from inside my house or somewhere out in the yard of visitors using the bench. More than a few times, I saw a young mother nursing her infant in the restful spot I'd created there beneath the redwood. And I once observed two little girls on their way home from the nearby elementary school sitting on the bench and talking animatedly about the things that matter to little girls. One especially warm August day, I returned home from campus, and as I walked my bike up the boardwalk ramp into the welcome shade, I was surprised to see a young man stretched out and asleep on the bench. He was not very well groomed, and a large disheveled backpack lay on the ground nearby. I don't think he had a place to call home, but he'd found a pleasant temporary home on the cedar bench. I didn't bother him, but instead just quietly wheeled my bike past him and on my way up to the house. Later that afternoon, when I went back outside, he was gone. Seeing these visitors and many others over the years reminds me on a regular basis that my bench, as costly as it was to have built in the first place, has repaid me many times with the heartwarming scenes I've witnessed. But the most touching scene I've ever observed at the bench occurred this past spring, on the first day of April. Because I had to remove the lovely redwood tree several years ago, the bench is now somewhat more exposed to the public eye, and to my eyes as well, from the upstairs loft of my house where my desk faces a window that looks out over the front yard. But I tried to compensate for the loss of the tree and the privacy its dense canopy afforded by building an attractive wooden arbor over the bench and the small brick terrace adjacent to it, and by planting vines and small trees nearby. So passers-by continued to be attracted to the bench now for very much the same reasons they were drawn to it when the redwood still stood. I'd been working on a project at my desk for much of the lovely spring afternoon, occasionally raising my head from my work to just gaze outside toward the distant hills or into the tops of the young trees in the front yard. I hadn't noticed anyone at the bench, and I certainly don't watch the bench per se from my observation tower in the loft, yet I can't help but notice sometimes when visitors arrive, especially if I can hear their voices. This particular afternoon, I glanced out at one point and saw that a young couple had arrived and were sitting on the bench. They looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. When I first noticed them, they were sitting side by side and not touching each other. The young woman sat with her head upright and was looking straight ahead. She was evidently talking to the young man at her side, who sat with his head deeply bowed, his chin almost on his chest. Evidently, some small or large tragedy had occurred, and the young man might even have been weeping. But I didn't think much of it, and of course didn't want to intrude on their privacy, so I concentrated once again on my work. The next time I looked out the window, maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, the young man had straightened up, but I could see from the look on his face that he continued to be distraught. The young woman had reached over to him with her left hand and was toying with the hair on the back of the young man's head. I smiled, but was a little teary-eyed myself at what I was witnessing. After a few more minutes of desk work, I looked outside once more, not quite as absent-mindedly as I had the first 2 times. Now, her head was leaning on his right shoulder, and his head was leaning on her against hers. More desk work. The 4th and last time I looked out, I smiled broadly to see that the young man's girlfriend, evidently, was sitting on his lap, and they had their arms around each other. I wanted to believe that whatever difficulty there had now been resolved, or at least discussed amicably, during the half hour or so they'd spent on the bench. My 4th glance out the window was as brief as the other 3 had been. Each time, I just happened to note changes since the previous glance, then got back to minding my own business. Sometime later, when I looked out one more time, the young couple had already departed. I seldom sit on my own bench, but knowing the role it's played over the past 15 years in the lives of countless visitors, most of whom I did not happen to see, brings me a great deal of joy. The bench that I designed with my own personal comfort in mind has, in the end, provided comfort to many others in a variety of ways. It's been a very worthwhile investment. This is, since Margaret referred to one of my past jobs as a male cocktail waitress, it's the essay about that's going to be in my new book here, which is Words from the Woods, 2004 to 2008. So I'm going to take the liberty of explaining about my life as a male cocktail waitress. So, okay, the title of the essay is I Was a Male Cocktail Waitress. And there's also one in the same collection that's called I Was a Male Secretary. So, okay, during my first year of graduate school at Oregon State University, 1977-78, I had a teaching assistantship that covered most of my tuition and other expenses. I was paid $306.76 a month to teach 2 labs of introductory botany, both fall and winter terms, and 2 labs of plant taxonomy spring term. But I occasionally took on other temporary or part-time work, especially between terms, to augment my income. Without a question, my most interesting job was at the Corvallis Moose Lodge, where I was hired to serve drinks on weekend nights. When filling out the application at the lodge one mid-autumn weekday, I was uncertain of what to write where the form asked what position I was applying for. So I asked Joan, who would eventually be my supervisor, and she said, "Well, the rest of us are cocktail waitresses, but you can't call yourself that." But neither of us could think of a better title, so she suggested that I just write male cocktail waitress in the blank. I smiled at her and thought to myself, this is going to look great on my resume someday. So my typical work night began at 8:30 p.m. and lasted until 2 or 2:30 the following morning. I was paid $2.50 an hour, plus I got to keep all my tips. My first night was a little slow, but I met Biff, the other male cocktail waitress, and we really hit it off. Biff and Whitey, what a pair. However, we saw little of each other that night as he was working the bingo hall upstairs. I worked the basement where a band played for much of the evening. The lights, as well as the ceiling, were low, and the smoke was thick. Joan kept an eye on me, and the bartender helped me learn how to tell the drinks apart. I'd never even heard of a Tom Collins before, nor a Salty Dog, King Alphonse, Black Velvet, or Marguerite. I hadn't yet learned how to spell or pronounce correctly that last name, but it sounded like the French word for ox-eye daisy, so that's what I called it. My most memorable night at the number 1411 Lodge was New Year's Eve 1977, when I finally got to work the bingo hall upstairs. For weeks, I'd looked forward to the change from the dreary and loud downstairs to the airier, better lit, and quieter upstairs, even though it meant carrying every tray full of drinks up a flight of stairs and sometimes all the way across to the other side of the large bingo hall. The place was jam-packed that night. People had paid $12.50 at the door, and all their drinks after that were free. It was a strange scene to my eyes, as some people hoarded drinks and others ordered a new or different one before finishing their previous one. I recall seeing a table where one woman had nearly a dozen untouched Tom Collinses huddled together in front of her, and she was still ordering more. We waitresses, however, were told that it was not our job to put limits on customers drinking. It was New Year's Eve, and the Moose Lodge had arranged for buses to take home those customers who were unable to drive or to stand up once the party was over. But I have to admit that I tried to steer clear of the tables with the most visibly soused customers, although the tipsy, aptly enough, were often really good tippers. Although I had already worked at the lodge for several weeks, I had no idea what any of the drinks I was serving tasted like. I'd learned their names by then and was able to recognize them when the bartender called me to pick up my order. But if blindfolded and asked to distinguish a Tom Collins from a King Alphonse by sipping them, I wouldn't have had the faintest idea. And of course, I wasn't allowed to drink even a sip on the job. But that rule was about to be broken. It was well into the evening, but not yet midnight, when one table of 4 ordered Singapore slings all around. It was the first time anyone had ordered that drink, so I was eager to see what it looked like. When I picked up my order at the bar downstairs, I found 4 very pink drinks in tall, attractive glasses. I whisked my way past the throngs of people on the dance floor, then headed for the bingo hall. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped briefly on the mid-flight landing below the huge stuffed moose head that hung on the wall there. No one else was in sight. I was dying to know what the drink tasted like, so I took an ever so tiny sip from one of the glasses. Not bad. It was so sweet that I couldn't really taste the alcohol. Then I noticed that for as tiny as my sip had been, one glass was now decidedly less full than the other three. So I took a second sip from the second glass. Still, no one was coming. Quick, a third sip. By now I was giggling to myself and feeling very naughty indeed, but I still had one sip to go. I couldn't help but glance up at the moose head just then, and I swear that he seemed to be looking right at me and saying, "Tisk, tisk. You know you're not supposed to do that." I laughed out loud and nearly dropped my tray right there in the landing, but somehow I collected myself, took the fourth sip, and continued on up to the bingo hall and my thirsty customers, none of whom seemed to notice that anything was amiss despite my decidedly pink lips. The place was already quite a zoo, but at the stroke of midnight, absolute bedlam broke out, and it lasted for most of the next hour. By that time, everyone knew who I was, but our dealings up to that point had been mostly professional. That quickly changed, however, thanks to the influence of alcohol and the unusually festive holiday atmosphere. I don't think I've ever been hugged and kissed by so many people in such a short span of time. Both men and women were putting plastic garlands around my neck and stuffing colored streamers and even money into my pants pockets. The women were especially fond of doing the latter, and I have to admit that I got a kick out of it myself. Eventually, things died down as one moose bus after the other left to deliver the revelers to their respective homes around the area. I cleaned up the emptied tables and prepared to head home myself by bicycle. My hair and clothes reeked of cigarette smokes. My pants pockets were bulging with streamers and tips. And as tired as I was after working for almost 7 hours without a break, I had to smile. I had had so much fun that evening, and although I still hadn't touched my lips to the salty rim of a margarita, I had finally had a sip of a Singapore sling, or rather, 4 sips of 4 Singapore slings. Dare I do another short one? Am I okay?
Sure, yeah, you're fine.
Let's see. So back to Nature Boy essays. Okay, an interrupted nap. The day before my weekly trip into the woods of the West Cascades, there had been an afternoon thundershower in the mountains. But I was unaware of that because in Eugene, where I live, some 60 miles away, it had been dry all day. So I was completely unprepared to walk through soaking wet forest floor vegetation. All I had were my hiking boots, which aren't especially waterproof. And I seldom carry my rubber boots or my waterproof overpants during Oregon's long summer drought. No matter. By carefully choosing my route through the forest and my individual footsteps, I made it mostly dry-footed to a favorite spot, then set up my green tarp lean-to spend a quiet day in that one place instead of wandering about and getting both wet shoes and soaked pant legs. I had a feeling there might be another shower in the clouds overhead, and sure enough, late forenoon, it did rain a bit. I'd eaten my breakfast mid-morning, then had a little nap, did some writing, and the rest of the time just looked out into the forest. 4 of my favorite activities: eating, sleeping, writing, and daydreaming. And soon it was lunchtime. After lunch, I lay down again on my wool blanket for another nap. What a life. When I'm napping in the woods, I usually lie on my side with my head on a makeshift pillow of whatever extra clothing I have in my pack, and my legs and shoeless feet pulled up slightly toward my torso. It's very comfortable, and both before I fall asleep and as I wake up, I find myself just looking out into the forest. I'd been sound asleep for maybe an hour. I don't wear a watch when I'm in the woods, when I was gently awakened by the sound of a large animal nearby that was moving slowly through the forest floor vegetation. I know what a deer's movement sounds like, and it wasn't a deer. And there weren't many other choices. I wasn't afraid either, as I've learned through the years that there are really no animals in these woods that I need to fear, as long as I'm prudent in my own actions. And since I was lying on the ground with my back to the vertical side of my tarp lean-to and looking out, I knew that I was safe and sound. So, while still lying down, I opened my eyes. All I saw was greenery. My lean-to is at the base of a bowl-like topographic feature I call amphitheater, because the nearby hillside rises gently from where I sit or lie in a 180-degree arc up to a little ridge. And my quote-unquote audience in this amphitheater is all of the ferns and shrubs looking down on me. There are very few trees on the hillside, so the view is quite open, which I like, as denser forests sometimes make me feel a bit claustrophobic. Then I noticed some movement near the top of the slope, maybe 50 or 60 feet away, just some shrubbery shaking in the still air. And shortly after that, I saw the pointed black head of a bear appear. I smiled and said to myself, "Number 6. Because I see bears and cougars so seldom, I remember very well each and every one of my encounters with them, and I'd already had 5 encounters with bears over my 30 years in the woods here. This bear looked like a yearling, the third yearling I've seen up here, that probably got kicked out of the house fairly recently by its mom and was just getting accustomed to life on its own. It would have been born early in 2013, so it was just over a year old. I finally sat up slowly to get a better look, but as I did, the bear ambled out of my view and deeper into the forest. It had never caught wind of me, as the air was completely still at the time. I lay back down, smiling, content to have had another brief encounter with one of the splendid creatures who share this forested ridge with me.